There seems to be a sale everywhere you look, pulling in some bargain hunters.
They're selling at a pretty good price, pretty competitive pricing.
But as Australia grapples with a cost of living crisis, not everyone is buying into the retail hype.
I try to actually minimise my shoppings this year.
I don't want to spend just to spend money, you know.
Black Friday isn't an Australian thing. Why do we have it here?
So here we have a selection of good old-fashioned family games.
For David Wall, it's a crucial time for his business.
Black Friday sales for sure have taken over the traditional Boxing Day sales, so it is the peak period of the year.
Like most retailers, Hobbyco began discounting its goods in early November, much earlier than it has in the past.
It's definitely very competitive out there. Discretionary spend is obviously down, but there's still going to be spend for Christmas. People still want to take that time out to have that gift-giving season.
Australians are expected to spend a record $6.36 billion during the Black Friday Cyber Monday weekend, which is 3% higher than 2022. And between November to Christmas, they're expected to fork out $67.1 billion, which is similar to last year.
Shoppers are looking for deals, they're shopping on a budget, and they're looking for every promotional offer that's possibly available from the retail community.
Even if these November sales do turn out to be record-breaking, economists say the months ahead will probably get tougher.
Around 40% of consumers are looking to spend less this year than they did last year. That's a pretty penny-pinching approach to consumer spending in the Christmas period.
In fact, they're feeling deeply pessimistic. According to Westpac, consumer confidence is sitting at its weakest level since the height of the COVID pandemic, which is bad news for retailers.
So July through to the end of September, they were really tough times for us. But once we get into January, I think we're really going to see a real challenge as it relates to consumer confidence and the way consumers are looking to buy moving forward.
By lifting interest rates 13 times in the past year and a half, the Reserve Bank's plan to bring inflation down is to inflict economic pain on us so that we spend less at the shops. And the RBA governor says her task is not over yet, as inflation is becoming a homegrown problem as opposed to one we imported from overseas.
Hairdressers, dentists, dining out, sporting and other recreational activities, the prices of all these services are rising strongly.
She warned the rate hikes may not be over, which would be another hit to retailers.
We've got model trains for 3-year-olds. As a small family-owned business, those interest rate hikes hurt us as well. We've also got the added bonus of increased wages, increased electricity costs, increased shipping fees. We're all working harder for a whole lot less than what we have done in the past.
Unfortunately, that looks to be the track we'll be stuck on for a while.
As David Chow reports, while the silly season is upon us, it was a sober message from the Reserve Bank's new boss. Michele Bullock is warning the bank must use its blunt tool of jacking up rates to hammer out what she says is the threat of homegrown inflation. Tapas Strickland is the head of market economics for National Australia Bank.
Tapas Strickland, welcome to the business.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Alicia.
Tapas Strickland, how effective is Michele Bullock's blunt tool in reining in homegrown inflation?
It's a very good question, and there is definitely a domestic-driven component to the inflation that we're seeing today. And one way you can answer that is inflation is still relatively persistent, so perhaps it is actually the RBA cash rate is having an impact, but the cash rate itself is just not high enough to have the amount of impact that you would like in order to reduce inflationary pressures quick enough. And that was part of the reason why the RBA did indeed hike rates at the November meeting.
When it comes to the blunt tool trying to dampen inflation, it appears it's disproportionately hurting Australians, those at the lower end of the income spectrum. But Michele Bullock last night did argue that it's necessary to cause that pain to save them from further pain at the end.
I think in Australia there is an overwhelming focus on mortgage holders, and sometimes we forget that only about 1/3 of Australians actually own with a mortgage, 1/3 actually rent, and 1/3 own outright. For the renters who aren't as exposed to a rising rate environment, what they actually are more exposed to is high inflation. So the longer that inflation persists, the greater impact that does have on that renter cohort. And we all know about the story behind rental inflation and the amount of inflation that is going on in these essential services and essential goods bits of the consumer price basket. So in some sense, yes, it is a blunt tool, but in some sense we have to get inflation down, because whereas interest rates may affect a certain segment of the population, high inflation affects everyone across the Australian population.
There is some irony, though, isn't there, that interest rates can't bring rents down and in many cases are helping push them up?
Yes, so there are many factors that are driving rents at the moment, and the sharp recovery in population growth that we did see, which to some extent is catch-up for all the missed population growth that we did see during the pandemic, is one of the major drivers for why rents have risen so sharply over the past year. In terms of a CPI basket, so exactly what inflation measures, rent is one component of that. It has about a 6% weight. So if rent inflation is growing relatively strongly, that means other bits of the consumer price basket have to grow at slightly slower rates in order to accommodate that rent increase. So that is what the RBA is trying to do. They've got a very blunt instrument, but overall they're trying to get the average price of that consumer basket growing by around 2 to 3% on average over the cycle. At the moment it is growing too high, and rents are definitely one component of that, but it does suggest that other components of the basket have to grow a little bit slower in order to accommodate the lift in rents as well.
Well, in the story ahead of us on Black Friday, we just heard a lot of discount is going on this week, but Michele Bullock has warned businesses are developing a bit of a mindset of passing on costs.
That is definitely what we have seen, and indeed when you look at the NAB business survey, and we survey about 400 businesses a month, and it's Australia's largest business survey. In that survey, it's quite clear that firms have been able to pass on higher input costs into final prices, and I think that goes to illustrate the degree of demand that is out there in the Australian economy in the aggregate sense, is allowing firms to pass through cost increases, whereas prior to the pandemic there was a greater hesitancy to pass through on those price increases because there's a lot of uncertainty exactly how that could impact on demand.
So how much of a risk is there that the inflation expectations are baked in?
There is a growing risk that inflation expectations have risen. You haven't necessarily seen it in the measures, but the anecdotes you do hear out there are firms are more able to pass on higher input costs in terms of their final prices. You have seen wage agreements settle at around 4%, and indeed you've seen strike action pick up, and a lot of people talking about being needed to be compensated for the inflation that we have seen over the past couple of years. So I think in some sense the inflation expectations are slowly rising, and in that respect it was quite encouraging. I was lucky to be in the audience of the event that Governor Bullock spoke at, where I asked her a question about the inflation target and specifically targeting the midpoint of that inflation target. And the RBA board has been communicating about getting inflation back to the top of that target by the end of 2025. It does leave people a little bit uncertain exactly what the RBA is targeting. Are they targeting 2.5%? Are they targeting 3%? And because it's taken all the way until 2025, at least on this set of forecasts, to get inflation back towards that band, there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of how tolerant the RBA is to above target inflation as well. So in that environment, no surprise to me why there are some anecdotes out there why inflation expectations actually may be rising in this environment.
So when it comes to wielding this blunt tool, how many more times will we see it pulled out? I mean, in comparable economies like the US and Canada, rates are well over 5%.
That's right, and that's the big risk here, is the RBA has been treading this line about wanting to preserve the gains in the labour market, and it's a very noble aim too, but no one really knows exactly to what degree can we preserve those gains while also getting inflation back to target in a reasonable time frame. And because of that, the RBA cash rate is currently at 4.35%, whereas the cash rates offshore, particularly in New Zealand, in the US, they're more sitting around that 5.5% level. So about a 1.25 percentage point gap between where our cash rate is and where the cash rate is offshore. At NAB, we think the RBA will lift the cash rate again in February, and you'd have to say the risk is, especially based on the hawkish messaging that Governor Bullock gave out, that the risk could be that the RBA does have to lift rates a little bit more in order to tame the degree of inflationary pressures in Australia.
Tapas, Strickland, thank you so much.
Thank you, Alicia.